Thank you.
I'm going to get us started just so we stay on time today. Welcome to the first of today's panels. I'm Terry Price. I'm the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs in the Jepson School. One problem we have today is we have much more talent than we have time, so I'm not going to do really any introductions at all, except to say the title of this panel is The Philosophic Foundations of Executive Power. We have 4 papers. They're going to spend about 15 minutes each to leave about 30 minutes for questions at the end. We'll first have Bob Faulkner from Boston College, Hugh Liebert from the Marshall Center at the University of Richmond, Tom Karako from Kenyon College, and then Paul Rahe from Hillsdale College. Bob, thanks.
My talk is called To Liberate Political Science, Mansfield on Aristotle and the Executive. Now, it's an instructive challenge to engage this book, and it's a special pleasure to do it in this nice, very nice circle at Richmond. Taming of the Prince is this kind of book, so penetrating on the executive as to illuminate modern government in general, and indeed modern political science in general. I've known this from the time that I read the later chapters, which made me tear up a draft on Locke's constitutionalism and start afresh. But what I speak about today is the book's great value for understanding ancient political science and thus, perhaps, true political science. That's the radicalness of Mansfield's argument. I say this despite the odd negative that once put me off and still puts people off. Mansfield's initial chapters discuss what is not there, why Aristotle did not set forth an executive. Now, there are 2 radical premises that underlie his mix of political intellectual history with political intellectual reform. First, the key to modern government is modern theory, and especially Machiavelli's new political science of effective control. Second, the new techniques of this science are techniques of tyranny, and the mirror that shows this is the old political science against which Machiavelli rebelled. Aristotle's comprehensive political science highlights the innovations and can recognize tyranny when it sees it, even if it be a soft despotism catering to basic human needs. His book, I think, fundamentally helps to liberate political science from 2 blinding preoccupations: efficacy and satisfying only basic needs. What of the dignity of choice or self-government, and of virtue or excellence in judgment and governing oneself? Now, my special responsibility today is the thematically classical chapters 2 and 3. They make the big argument. Where Aristotle might have set forth an executive, he sets forth instead a philosopher-king, a model of science and moderation, and a rather democratic mixed regime, a practicable model, allowing moderation in choice by the few and by the many, hence the mix between few, or conventionally put rich, and the many more poor. Now, explaining these arguments will take more time than I have, and I've had terrific warnings about not going beyond 15 minutes. But I have to say that the whole book bears on my topic, because the mirror, the Aristotelian mirror, is ubiquitous. This is the first time I've ever had a chance to use the word ubiquitous in a talk. It's really very pleasant. Chapters 4 and 5 show how St. Thomas, Dante, and Marsilius resorted for Aristotelian ends to un-Aristotelian doctrines, precisely to confront Machiavelli's specific problem: how to assure political prudence and political freedom in face of the biblical God's commands. Chapter 6 gives us 7 points of comparison between Machiavelli's executive and Aristotle's alternative, and 7 and 8 compare Aristotle with Hobbes on power and with Locke on consent. Indeed, the book's procedure is classical dialectical. We get away of the various forms or theories of executive authority. One that, in my understanding, for the first time makes the progression intelligible, from Hobbes to Locke to Montesquieu to the framers. we get to a comparison with the Aristotelian form of governing. But with all these theoretical comparisons, there is also wary prudence, or at least an appreciation of the best executive in modern circumstances. The book's epigraph is very filial, but it also celebrates the strong presidencies of both FDR and President Reagan. Indeed, the book ends with praise of American constitutionalism, which includes key arrangements that Machiavelli and Hobbes in particular left out: Republican freedom, considerable rule of law, and officers who defer to a certain comprehensive wisdom. I'm going to present the big points, then some particulars, and then some questions or difficulties. In all of this, I concentrate on Mansfield's question: what is left out of Machiavelli's plan? I leave for others a corresponding question: to what extent are the things still left out, even when executive power has been, as Mansfield shows with wonderful clarity, institutionalized, constitutionalized, moderated, and republicanized? If they are in, is anything wrong with a tamed version? Now, Mansfield is well aware that his return to an ancient mirror cannot but seem unnecessary to many. This office appears subordinate, appears our servant, while in this office of executive, and yet rises to rule behind our backs, so to speak. It's enjoyed vast success. As he points out, chief executives are everywhere, and not least in ours, the most modern country, thoroughly modern country, which has nevertheless surpassed in war and peace empires old like Spain and Britain and new like the Nazis and Soviets. Moreover, Mansfield acknowledges that the ancients had to deal with a fundamental problem that moved Machiavelli and his followers: the recalcitrance of each individual to just law and to wise reason. This naysaying, together with the generality of law, means that to an extent all law is an unfair imposition to some extent that neither every man nor the wise man would want for himself. It is to that extent tyrannical, says Mansfield, here too facing facts radically and even citing Plato. But Machiavelli's solution is different. His political science responded to human recalcitrance by introducing one-man tyranny as the necessary part of government, even of republics. Extremism in the pursuit of order is no vice. And indeed, timid spectacular execution on the Miro is the core of virtue, that is virtue. And the core of governing also. The way to govern is above all by stupefying as well as satisfying. But the classics did not give up on the fundamental authority, at least in principle, of law and reason, even if inevitably in politics these are but approximations to true justice and wisdom. The key approximations are two for the classics, he points out: the mixed regime and the Philosopher-King. The mixed regime moderates the most powerful division in politics between rich and poor. It moderates their claims to justice. The Philosopher-King guides from afar as to how to moderate and for what. The result in law and fundamental laws can be some approximation to his wisdom as to the defects of democratic and oligarchic justice. There is then a kind of king of all in a philosophic sense. He supplies a sort of standard. He is, one could say, Prospero of Shakespeare's Tempest, an enlightener in the classical sense amidst the storms of nature, politics, and the soul. But he is emphatically not a king in practice. Aristotle was not in favor of kingship in that sense. I would raise one question: except in extraordinary circumstances. That would not be accepted, and it would be unjust to the other claims, to freedom for people generally, and to justice. Machiavelli's philosopher, however, was also to be a ruler by and for himself. strong in followers because offering to satisfy their strongest desires or to intimidate their worst fears. He is the truest prince, uno solo, controlling even the civilization to come by raising princes and republics strong and therefore likely to rise to domination. Aristotle's king is not a tyrant nor a leader in horrific acts. He's also not a futurist, and this Mansfield sees. Also, Machiavelli's executive leads by fraud, conspiracy, as well as violence. It's a big part of the argument. How could it be only 5 minutes left? That's impossible. And here too, Mansfield suggests that too is in fact, doesn't do justice to the aspirations and dignity of human beings generally, and especially decent ones. Aristotle gives advice then to the practical person of what to do. Favor, O moralist, the decent gentleman and the thoughtful thinker. Favor, O founder, a middle class. For those of middling property, moderate the partisanship of rich and poor and produce more reasonable statesmen and founders. The core of what Machiavelli leaves out then is this: for people's political and personal freedom and civic virtue, for statesmen and their wise partners in human perfection, a responsibility and judgment for the whole of politics and life. And now a few particulars. First, while Aristotle notes the possibility of a general for life in all regimes, he does not move, as Mansfield puts it, to establish a fund of arbitrariness to govern willful man, unquote. Hence, no executive, no use of emergencies as excuse for extending power. Where Aristotle distinguishes functions of rule, deliberation, magistracies, judicial, and he might have commended a unitary chief magistracy, he keeps magistracies plural to keep government free and accountable as well as useful. Aristotle too talks of judging and says it involves calling men to account for their misdeeds, but he dwells on a standard outside oneself that gives critical distance, not on judging as a means of defending and imposing oneself or one's state. Justice is the point, not decisiveness, and not stupefying or satisfying by very strong punishments. Nothing appears. Aristotle would weaken and divide the various punishing officers. Nothing like Machiavelli's advice appears. You who want to be ambitious, take the odious office and accumulate its force so as to rise to power. I'll close with a few questions or difficulties. I can't tell you all the valuable things I'm leaving out. Yes. First, in seeing the mixed regime as the best practical regime, does Professor Mansfield slight Aristotle's praise for the great man and the great and just man, for the Washington, and for the somewhat aristocratic regime in ethics 4 and 5 first, and in politics 3, 4, and especially 7. He doesn't discuss that I noticed. A second point, Mansfield doesn't make much of simple moral objections. Punishing or killing without scruple is on the face of it horrific or wrong, and especially for one's own domination. Machiavelli's project, Mansfield said, leaves out provision for, quote, higher faculties of choice and deliberation. Still, it's not the cruel or unjust thing, the most obvious violation of the rule of higher faculties. Is Mansfield's focus on the recalcitrant individual and on choice somewhat too individualistic for the classics? Does it slight somewhat the political friendship that they also talk about, and slight too a certain superiority in the gentleman statesman? sometimes Mansfield's way of arguing from natural individuality and choice reminds more of Hobbes or Kant than of Aristotle. And a final point. Finally, Mansfield says very little of the crisis of modern philosophy generally, of its undermining of its original premises with historicism, value-free social science, relativism, and whatever we mean by this, postmodernism, to say nothing of the rise of socialism and fascism as practical criticism. It seems to me this in itself would call for a deeply revised political science. Or is Mansfield here, as in many places, being politic? Is his prudential treatment, his silence on this deep issue, a way of showing to political scientists, as well as to conservatives, a new kind of Aristotelian support, even for executive power in a modern country? This seemed to me what Mansfield sought in another extraordinary and indispensable book on modern government, America's Constitutional Soul. Thank you.
Terry, will the mics work if I stand? Yeah. Okay, so I'm speaking on executive power in Roman political thought. In Mansfield's account of the Roman regime, Rome is home to, quote, strong executives in a republican setting. These are the Roman consuls and dictators. But however Machiavellian individual consuls and dictators might seem, they are, according to Mansfield, ultimately mere proto-executives, indeed pseudo-executives, because Roman political philosophers were too wedded to an Aristotelian view of nature to realize in theory the full consequences of the facts before their faces. Roman political philosophy, on Mansfield's telling, merely drapes Aristotle in a toga and teaches him to speak Latin. However, when you focus on the size of the Roman state, and I'm going to use the term political form to refer to state size here. When you focus on political form rather than the Roman regime, the distance between Greece and Rome starts to seem much greater. Mansfield suggests as much when he says that Rome manages to replace the Aristotelian debate between oligarchy and democracy with a new debate between republic and empire. Now, that debate has a constitutional side insofar as it pits one-man rule against the rule of more than one man. But it also addresses the issue of political form, which is to say state size, more explicitly than did the debates native to Greek cities. Partisans of empire champion human universality, whereas partisans of republics champion the particularity that enables citizens to share a unique political life in common. And both issues, political form and political regime, combine in the rule of Augustus, who embodies one-man rule that is also universal, or nearly so. Augustus can also lay a certain claim to the coveted title of first ambivalent executive. Mansfield actually suggests as much, albeit in passing, when he quotes Edward Gibbon to the effect that the Roman Senate appeared to possess the sovereign authority under the empire and devolved on the emperors all the executive powers of government. In other words, the regime that Augustus founds uses apparent weakness to increase the ruler's actual strength. Now, I think Gibbon's claim is worth taking seriously, and I want to argue in what follows that the Roman emperor amounts to something more than a mere proto or pseudo-executive. Instead, he's the real deal. Not because a Roman political philosopher anticipated Machiavelli, but because the imperial expansion of Rome's political form within the context of its republican regime gave rise to a compromised position, neither wholly republican nor wholly imperial. In short, an ambivalent executive. Now, I'm going to make that case in two stages. First, I want to lay some theoretical groundwork by talking about the issue of political form in Aristotle. And then I'm going to turn to talk about political form in Rome, in the decline of the Republic and the rise of the empire. And then I'll conclude by drawing out some implications for how my story about Rome might have some bearing on how we think about the American executive. So part one, Aristotle and political form. For Aristotle, as for Plato's Socrates, the best regime is a monarchy. But whereas the best regime of Plato's Republic implicitly limits the rule of philosopher-kings to a city, Aristotle writes of a kingship over everything and everyone. And he chooses a strange word for that sort of kingship, pambasileia, which literally means universal monarchy or absolute monarchy. Now, that word pambasileia appears very frequently after Aristotle, particularly in Christian authors like Eusebius, who use it to describe the Christian God. Before Aristotle, it also describes divinities, but it's very rare. It appears only once in a fragment of Alcaeus, I think, and twice in Aristophanes' Clouds, but that's it. Now, Aristotle defines pambasileia as, quote, domestic mastership, oikonomia, over a city or over one nation or over many nations, end quote. Pambasileia, then, means both absolute and universal monarchy, and it's probably meant to carry some of its earlier divine theological resonance as well. That's Aristotle's best regime. In his interpretation of Aristotle's Pambasileus, Mansfield focuses most of his attention on the idea of absolute rather than universal rule. The man of perfect virtue, like Plato's Philosopher-King, would rule justly without any limit on his authority. Nevertheless, Aristotle dramatizes the Philosopher-King's acceptance of the need to legislate, and then his abdication of absolute rule altogether by descending into the political fray and trying to weave together a moderate mixed regime out of partisan debates. In Mansfield's words, the Pambasileus, quote, accepts nature's gift of thumos, spirit, to all men, and he also accepts its consequences. He wills human willfulness, end quote. Now, why would an absolute ruler will human willfulness? Well, there's a practical concern that Aristotle shares with Plato's Socrates, that no matter how just and rational the ruler, it's difficult to convince individuals to submit themselves to an absolute ruler. There's also a pedagogical concern. Even if the Pambasileus, in his wisdom, were able to dictate to individuals what's best for them according to nature, he might do better to let them discover it on their own. In willing human willfulness, then, the Pambasileus both bows to necessity and enables his would-be subjects to take responsibility, and thereby to win honor on their own. Now, if we consider the Pambasileus from the perspective of political form rather than that of political regime, that is, if we emphasize the universality rather than the absoluteness of his rule, we discover an argument parallel to the one that Mansfield suggests. Just as the Pambasileus relinquishes his absolute rule for the sake of law and partisan debate, so he relinquishes his universal rule for the sake of the city. And in this case, too, this amounts to willing human willfulness. That is, the decision turns on an acceptance, indeed an empowerment, of thumos. Aristotle says that the barbarians who live in the tiny tribes to the north of Greece are full of spirit, they're full of thumos, but they lack intelligence. Whereas the barbarians who live in expansive nations to the south and east of Greece are full of intelligence, but they lack spirit. The Greeks who live in cities, however, are more spirited than the southerners and smarter than the northerners. In choosing the city, then, the Pambasileus wills this Greek sort of willfulness, thumos leavened with intelligence. As a practical matter, it's difficult for mere mortals to extend their rule over mankind as a whole, and as a pedagogical matter, the political form of the city allows citizens to develop as judges of character and to win recognition for ruling. So that's a parallel argument, I think, to Mansfield's interpretation of absolute rule. However, the choice of the Pambasileus against universal rule sheds light on an aspect of thumos that the choice against absolute rule left in the dark, and that's the relationship between thumos and divisibility. Aristotle says that the city is a self-sufficient community that can be taken in a view. It's ius synoptos. And to explain what he means by taken in a view, he talks about the troops on a battlefield and citizens gathered in an assembly. The Greek cities, then, are visible communities, but only at certain moments in civic life. And it's this sort of community, it's in that sort of community where thumos, leavened with intelligence, arises. The vast barbarian nations, by contrast, are imaginary communities, and their lack of spirit shows in their acceptance of rule by invisible powers. The tiny barbarian tribes are immediately and constantly visible communities, and their excessive spiritedness shows in their acceptance of rule only by individuals intimately familiar to them. And both of these barbaric political forms result in one-man, quasi-divine rule. The Eastern despots are themselves considered divine, whereas the petty tribal chieftains, like the Roman paterfamilias, are priests to their progeny. It's thumos, shaped within the political form of the city, that is linked not to one-man rule, but to competing claims to know what is best for the city, the claims that are open to the sort of interpretation Aristotle provides in the Politics, where they seem to be interpretations of nature simply. So, in other words, the choice for the political form of the city is not incidental to the choice of partisan debate capable of being guided towards a mixed regime. Willing willfulness entails both. And we find in Aristotle, then, good reason to doubt that large states can sustain the spirit necessary for the sort of political life a Pambasileus could endorse. large political forms, imaginary rather than visible communities, tend to invest their leaders with quasi-divine status. This tendency is not discernible, though, from attention to constitutions alone, but stems from the influence of limited visibility on the balance between thumos and intelligence. Okay. Now, I want to turn to Rome in order to put some historical meat on Aristotle's theoretical bones. The Roman Republic begins with Publius and ends 500 years later with Augustus. It starts with a humble republican consul and ends with a divinized emperor struggling to keep up the appearance of republican propriety, all the while ruling over the inhabited world. Now, there are many ways of accounting for how we get from Publius to Augustus. It's possible to focus narrowly on the Roman regime in order to describe the changes it's prone to, as Polybius does with his famous cycle of regimes. But it's more common to focus on Roman political form, that is, to claim that imperial expansion destroyed the Republic, whether by exacerbating class strife or by corrupting Roman mores. In Plutarch's Lives, one can glean a compelling variant of the political form theory of republican decline, and that's what I want to focus on here. Now, the lead role in Plutarch's theory is played by Pompey the Great. For Plutarch, Pompey forged a position of impregnable power within Roman political life, one that had never been seen before him but endured for a long time after his death. Plutarch compares his position to a citadel, which once it comes into being can lend its strength to friends as well as to enemies, like Caesar and his heirs. On Plutarch's telling, the expansion of the Roman Republic provides Pompey with the materials to construct this citadel. And it does so not by increasing class strife or by corrupting morals, but by altering the conditions that shaped Roman thumos. That is, expansion both changed the nature of the achievements for which a statesman could win honor, and more importantly, it altered the sort of honor that was available to them. Nothing reveals the novelty of the challenges facing the statesmen of Pompey's Rome so clearly as the countless pirates who infest her provinces in the early first century. Now, pirates have always been with us in one form or another. Thucydides says that early on in Greece, being a pirate was a perfectly respectable profession, and it seems that that's still true in certain parts of the world, like Somalia today. And that's to say nothing of Long John Silver and Jack Sparrow and all of those guys. But the piracy that threatened Republican Rome was something new in the world, because the extent of Roman power was something new in the world. These pirates lived largely by raiding the vast trade Rome enabled, and their operations and governing structures extended into a multinational network rivaled only by the reach of Rome. In 67 BCE, the Roman people finally get fed up with all of this, and they demand that the Senate declare a global war on piracy. But this was not an easy war for a republic to wage. Combating an elusive global enemy seemed to require a leader far more potent than the traditional provincial governors, and more powerful even than the republic's dictators, whose authority was normally restricted to Italy. Plutarch calls the command against the pirates an out-and-out monarchy. In the pirates, then, the political form of the Roman Republic had given birth to a problem the scale and scope of which seemed to require a solution that threatened the republican regime. And it's Pompey who seemed the natural choice to fill that unprecedented position. Now, the expansion of the Republic, though, changes not only the sorts of challenges Roman statesmen confront, it also changes the sort of honor they receive for confronting them. The further Rome's horizons expand, the more citizens start to praise their leaders in the worshipful tones dear to Eastern despots. Pompey, for his part, inspires debased devotion throughout Italy and wins extravagant praise among the ever-increasing mass of the urban plebs. Plutarch says that when the Senate seemed reluctant to appoint Pompey to an honorable post, the masses, quote, made such a loud outcry that a crow flying over the marketplace at that instant was struck and dropped down among the crowd, end quote. The vox populi here resembles a mushroom cloud. Not only has Pompey ushered a new political force into Roman life, but it's almost as if he's introduced a new physical force into the universe. Pompey is all but worshipped in precisely those sectors of the Roman population, the urban plebs and the Italian citizens, whose growth has extended Roman horizons past any analogy to the visible community of the city. It's the political force of this new form of honor, combined with the precedent of boundless one-man rule in Pompey's command against the pirates, that secures the strength of the citadel Pompey constructs. And it's this citadel that Julius Caesar and then Augustus occupy. Julius Caesar, of course, made a great show of rejecting diadems and crowns, even while ruling within forms familiar to the Republic, like the dictatorship, although he stretched these beyond their customary limits. And from Caesar's assassination, Augustus seems to have drawn the lesson that extremism in defense of ambivalence is no vice, to paraphrase Robert Faulkner. Even while amassing informal power, far surpassing that of his predecessor, he constrains his formal power, quite radically, as Gibbon noted. In the Res Gestae, Augustus boasts of restoring the Republic to the Senate and people of Rome, and it's with this sort of studied ambivalence that Augustus reconciles Rome to his rule. His success is such that by the end of his reign, as Tacitus said, there were few alive who had seen the Republic. Subsequent emperors will all rule over the universe and be divinized whatever their personal merits. And thus an ambivalent executive arises out of an expansive republic, only to ultimately bequeath an office more monarchical or tyrannical than Rome's strong executives in a republican setting. Now, I want to conclude now. I've suggested so far that the lack of visibility inherent in large political forms breeds a mode of honoring that tends to elevate the recipient of honor and diminish the individual who awards it. The intuitive force of that point is captured by the saying, "No man is a hero to his valet." Now, the customary reply, which was first made in Hegel's Phenomenology, but was put more intelligibly by Thomas Carlyle, is, quote, "It's not the hero's blame, but the valet, that his soul, namely, is a mean valet soul," end quote. And indeed, one would hope that true heroes are admired even more by those who see them up close and therefore have a better view of their virtues. But this line is nevertheless useful for thinking about other modes of honoring, as when we look on a fellow mortal as a god or a celebrity. The Gospel of Mark tells us that when Jesus visited his hometown and began to preach, the audience was skeptical, and Jesus couldn't perform his usual miracles. And surely all of the sublime beauty and glamorous vice we admire in our celebrities becomes rather diminished when seen firsthand. No man is a celebrity, after all, to his designated driver. Now, I've tried to show how these unrepublican modes of honoring arose in the Roman Republic, and though it's probably foolish to suggest more than a passing similarity between ancient and modern politics, we still might ask, don't we, in fact, see tendencies towards these outsized modes of praise in our own politics? And don't we also see tendencies towards outsized modes of blame as well? If our executives have begun to seem by turns superhuman celebrities and subhuman monstrosities, perhaps it has something to do with the political form within which our political regime operates. Now, Mansfield's prescription for what ails the American regime is a stiff dose of constitutionalism. He doesn't go quite so far as Lincoln, who recommended that a political religion consisting of reverence for the laws be breathed by every American mother to the lisping babe that prattles on her lap. Nevertheless, he agrees with Lincoln that thumos, the love of fame of the noblest minds and the towering geniuses, must be diverted from charisma and demagoguery towards the extensive and arduous enterprises that Publius prescribed. Now, I want to suggest that constitutionalism without federalism, and perhaps without localism, is insufficient. Those who have championed the role of lesser political forms within the American nation have stressed how they enable citizens to develop the sort of spirit that admires heroes but bristles at hero worship. These lesser forms allow souls that might otherwise be prone to prostrate themselves to strive for honor. They elevate the merely noble rather than the noblest minds. They elevate the B+ students, graded unironically. These lesser political forms were the townships of Tocqueville and the wards of Jefferson, who once said, quote, "As Cato then concluded every speech with the words Carthago delenda est, so do I every opinion with the injunction, divide the counties into wards." And that's a good enough conclusion for me, too. Thanks.
Well, thank you, first of all, to Gary McDowell and the Marshall Center for putting on this very useful conference to commemorate this book and the larger Mansfieldian enterprise. The phrase modes and orders is often professed to be one of Machiavelli's most significant. Commentators often repeat the phrase like a drumbeat to emphasize their newness as opposed to the old modes and orders. The phrase somehow seems to be shorthand for whatever it is that Machiavelli is up to. But the newness of the modes and orders is often the only thing that's said about them. An example of the loose understanding, one of my favorites, is by John Whitfield, who says that modes are, quote, slightly vaguer than orders, but that modes, orders, institutions, and statutes are all more or less synonyms. So is the phrase modes and orders merely shorthand for whatever Machiavelli's up to? Or can one find what Locke called a clear and distinct idea of both modes and orders? And it's only with Harvey Mansfield's writing that you see this clear and distinct analysis. This year marks the 20th anniversary of Taming the Prince. It also marks the 30th anniversary of his very useful commentary on the discourses entitled Machiavelli's New Modes and Orders. If Strauss's thoughts on Machiavelli is akin to Columbus's coming ashore on a new continent, rediscovering Machiavelli's new continent, these two books together are akin to Lewis and Clark's expedition. First going machete in hand through this new wilderness, and second, laying out in Taming a very clear map of the contours of this new moral continent. So drawing on both of these, I want to briefly summarize the use of modes, a modo, orders, ordini, and a third term sometimes I think confused with both, the all-important way or path, the via. I'll begin by suggesting that the most critical beginning point here is what Mansfield mentioned last night, that what Machiavelli is doing is replacing the formal dichotomy between the lawful and the unlawful with this new continuum, an informal continuum between the ordinary and the extraordinary. What is said about orders applies to what is ordinary, and an extraordinary mode of action is something that takes place outside of law and order. Okay, this is it's Machiavelli's path to introduce this new understanding that carves up the human phenomena in a new way. This new continuum comes to light only from the perspective of the executive, the princely executive, who stands astride political, moral, religious, legal, or orders. He stands astride them and outside of them because he creates them. Now, Machiavelli is not above toying with his reader, but there is, as Mansfield suggests in one place, although this is not presented systematically, it is in fact a system worthy of being called a political science. Now, Machiavelli differs, to begin, from the classical political philosophers based on a different attitude toward nature. Machiavelli is keenly aware, of course, of the connection between nature and politics to form natural right, but he is impelled to choose against it. In his time, the connecting of politics to natural perfection of the mortal soul has had the unintentional effect of supporting those who claim to rule on behalf of the immortal soul. Forget Socrates' good intentions. His alibi that evil is involuntary. The effectual truth of Platonism's soul talk is pious tyranny. The pursuit of the truth for its own sake is all too neutral. Machiavelli's word is the via neutrale, to its own political consequences. And in this world war, a policy of neutrality is a luxury mankind cannot afford. So Machiavelli thus engages in a self-consciously partisan or partial view or abstraction from natural right. Nature is still present in his political science, but it's redefined. Statecraft as soulcraft is reoriented to bodily necessity. What Machiavelli calls natural and ordinary, the desire to acquire. Aristotle had, of course, depreciated in his science of material acquisition as ignoble and unnatural in Book 1 of the Politics. Machiavelli's primary enemy is priestly rule, and incidentally, only Aristotle. But to combat the former, he cannot follow the path of the latter. The dominion, the institutions, and the actions of Christianity cannot be shoehorned into the classical framework or taxonomy of regimes. However beautiful, as Aristotle called it, that outlook was too narrow to comprehend and categorize the modes and orders of Christian princes. Philosophic wonder is also worse than useless. It's dangerous because it encourages one to marvel. So like Rousseau, Machiavelli engages in philosophy while discouraging it as a political proposition. Instead, he's going to carve up human phenomena with the how of modes and orders. Now, specifically, Machiavelli learned from Christianity that the state is broader than any conceivable regime or territory to comprehend all class of dominions, page 1 of The Prince, that claim imperium over men, be they legal, religious, military, or academic. Aristotle's regime analysis trails off when it comes to empires, right? But Christianity, the kingdom of Christianity, it claims empire over most of Western civilization. What kind of political science doesn't have anything interesting to say about empires other than to badmouth them. So modes plus orders do not equal a regime. They're not an extension of the sixfold taxonomy. They're not a tweaking of Aristotle's mixed regime, which both of those, all of those, still aimed at a moderate and virtuous middle way that is impossible to effect and therefore dangerous to promote. Instead, he moves the analysis to another plane, to this other continuum. From this plane, the six classical regimes are expressly demoted to mere modes. An oligarchy operates in the mode of a few, beginning of the discourses. Appearances are deceiving, so it's simply insufficient to ask how many rule and whether or not they rule for the public good. The same peoples who believe that what appears to be bread is not bread are liable to be taken in by ordinary political fraud. So formal appearances do not appreciate the fragility of orders, the shallowness of forms, the power of conspiracy and hidden rule. The things of state must be understood by analog to conspiracy. And in the face of this, it's safer to be paranoid and assume that the elite plot behind closed doors than to be blindsided by a well-executed conspiracy. The science of politics is indeed improved, to paraphrase the Federalist, by replacing the easily blinded who-centric regime with a more clear-eyed, how-centered approach, a vigilant and manly spirit suspicious of tyranny. So this is an institutional political science whose essence is not felt in formal claims to rule. All right, so now more specifically, modes, orders, and ways. I would suggest that in their interrelation, there is a kind of primacy or logical priority to the path or way of a prince, a secondary character of modes, and a tertiary and derivative importance for orders. The ways and path are the via is the most hidden, least formal, and least obviously political of these three categories. Via is the word used at the beginning of Prince chapter 7, where he says that most men do well to follow the paths beaten by others. He is walking a path not yet trodden, and he's encouraging his fellow conspirators to follow behind him and bring this project to its completion. A mode has neither a beginning nor an end, and in fact, the effect of operating in a given mode, you never know quite where it will lead because it all is determined by the times. By contrast, you walk a path or a road with some idea of taking it somewhere, right? Machiavelli will take this project to its destined place. So in other words, there is a kind of directedness in Machiavelli's cosmos, even if not in his political science. All is not reduced to matter and motion. He is at rest while his politics assumes constant motion. And he asks his readers to compare the relative merits of his path to the path of the academics, or the way shown by Christianity. A mode, second, is an attribute of an action or state of being which answers the question, how? Modes are more political and more visible than ways, but they categorize especially political being. There is no mode of a triangle, as you find in Locke. The vulgar view that Machiavelli is concerned only with the is as opposed to the ought has some purchase here. A mode determines the how of an action, not the what, the why, the who, or the thou shalt not. And once you start looking for modes, you find them everywhere. Over 500 times in the discourses, 91 times in the Prince, and the most infamous and spectacular episodes in Machiavelli turn out to be modes, usually extraordinary modes. The executions of Ramiro de Orco and the sons of Brutus are extraordinary modes to reorder a state. There are many, but not infinite number of modes, for this is a science. There are modes of ordering, expanding, acquiring, and of keeping. And what Machiavelli calls modes of acquisition were incidentally given no attention in the politics on the grounds that they are not beautiful or noble to discuss. But Machiavelli's times are different. He believes it's good to elevate the useful over the noble. Now, this is not to emphasize modes and orders analysis is not a call for unlimited acquisition or empire. There are limits, but practical substitutes free of exhortations to virtue must be found to approximate moderation. Okay, so moderation comes in through the back door through stability and longevity. By endorsing, for example, a limited empire rather than unlimited one, by emphasizing the fragility of orders and by recognizing how small modifications of things like elections can shape the behavior of princes and the expectations of peoples. Now, in contrast with the personal and changeable modes, orders appear more static, more formal, more tangible, and less personal. These include political and legal institutions and offices, but as the visible manifestation or projection of a prince's state, orders can be much more, include military, moral, and religious orders. Orders are what the many see, but they are therefore more distant from the mind of the prince. And their apparent firmness, which confirms the popular desire to want to believe in a single, natural, unchanging order of things, is only apparent. Machiavelli stresses, in contrast, the need to understand their fragility and their tendency to crumble under the silent artillery of time. Religious and academic orders, like political ones, are merely the manifestation or creation of some prince, and they can be reordered or co-opted from within. So very quickly, modes and orders classify the things of state. Modes are closer to the mind of the prince. Orders are more visible to the people. Modes manipulate orders, and they're the actual working of orders, and it's often hard to distinguish them, but extraordinary modes have a kind of priority to orders. Okay, now modes are a prince's way to adapt to changing circumstances. Machiavelli argues colorfully in chapter 25 of The Prince that one has to be impetuous rather than be cautious, to be good and know how to be not good according to necessity. How are we then to understand the changing of a mode, of a prince changing? I would answer with Machiavelli's distinction, for he does in fact make a distinction between a dictator and a tyrant. The two are not distinguished on the basis of justice or some highfalutin appeal to virtue. Instead, the dictator acquires authority not by his own making and not indefinitely, but through the mode of election and for a brief duration. A dictator is quite literally a modified tyrant. Now, we may say this is not good enough, this is not substantial enough, but he would say that the benefits from such modifications are not insignificant. And before you decide on this question, let me read from the early state constitution of Maryland. A long continuance in the first executive departments of power or trust is dangerous to liberty. A rotation is one of the best securities of permanent freedom. We operate within this kind of political science, and it's right in front of us, so we can't see it. I want to emphasize, too, that the content of these is especially learned from Christianity. This is Machiavelli's improvement upon classical political science. In Book 2, Chapter 21 of the Discourses, this is the new mode of imperium, which Professor Mansfield mentioned yesterday. It's disguised in a story by Livy, but there, explicitly, that's the most explicit statement in Machiavelli about the connection between the new modes and orders of ruling, of imperium, to indirect government. There it is said that cities are more content when they do not see their rulers directly. Turn quickly to The Prince. Chapter 1 opens with 13 modes of imperium, of exercising dominion, and he proceeds to analyze these. But that order is interrupted in chapter 11 when he introduces a new mode, ecclesiastical principates, a new mode of acquiring money, he says, and elsewhere, the only mode of election mentioned in The Prince is the curious mode of electing the Pope. The Pope has the benefit of appearing ancient, right, without appearing a natural prince, what he calls in chapter 2, but while of course he's new. Now, let's quickly apply this to our own politics. Orders seem easy, right? The American institutionalization of the executive and Congress into offices. The harder part is, of course, the lower order orders. For not just constitutional law, but statutes, military orders, executive orders, these too must be included. There's exactly 3 modes of making international agreements in our Constitution, or in our legal system: treaties, statutory agreements, and sole executive agreements. As for modes of election, I think of Jim Caesar's presidential selection, right? Think too of the 17th Amendment, whereby the mode of electing senators is changed from the state legislatures to the people and the order of the Senate. It's still there, but it has a changed character. And federalism, too, is affected. The rules and procedures of Congress, the fact that presidents didn't used to campaign in their own name, these kinds of things operate within these categories, I think, well. Our need for flexibility, right, we feel this, is in keeping with this political science of modes and orders. So let me conclude by returning to Machiavelli's discussion of the dictator as a modified tyrant. One improvement in Machiavelli's political science is to recognize that some changes are merely modifications, and that they are natural and ordinary rather than marvelous. But this example also reminds us that it was for a self-consciously partisan cause of freedom, for wartime necessity, that natural right was ignored, and that Machiavelli's political science carves up human phenomena in terms of modes and orders. But natural right was not Machiavelli's enemy as such, and it's not quite blotted out of existence by modes and orders. Philosophers might actually have a good life under a well-ordered state. Now that Machiavelli's battle is over and Italy is liberated, one would probably not want to go back to the old political science, he would say, because forgetting the things of state would be to let down one's guard to some of the more, to the easier and hidden paths to tyranny. But the changeableness of human affairs may make it necessary to draw things back and reintroduce the old nature standard and soul talk to supplement our political science of institutions. If so, he would probably say it would have to be done in a cautious mode and by some other different path. Thank you.
Very little has been written about Niccolo Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes. The latter never once mentions the former by name, and among historians, a kind in which I find myself, a certain prejudice prevails. The absence of evidence is often, without reflection, taken as positive evidence for absence. After all, historians tend to suppose, if Machiavelli was of any importance to Hobbes, the monster of Malmesbury would have mentioned the Florentine. Here, there is an obvious objection to be made, as the scholar whom we honor today knows as well as anyone. Thomas Hobbes was no more inclined to mention his predecessors by name than was Niccolo Machiavelli. Both men lived in circumstances in which the works of their predecessors were readily available. Both were exceedingly well read. Neither was inclined to make a parade of the extent of his erudition. Were it not for the accident that scholars have found in the Vatican Library a copy of Lucretius de Rerum Natura, copied out in its entirety, on the finest paper available, in the finest hand of Niccolo Machiavelli, we would be even slower than we have been to recognize the seriousness of his Auseinandersetzung with Epicureanism. Machiavelli and Hobbes are both exceedingly playful as writers. When the latter lifts a passage from Montaigne's essays, he knows perfectly well that very few readers will catch him at it. But that does not mean that he does not want to get caught by those with a keen eye. The theft of Montaigne's words is a wink and a nod to those in the know, and an indication of the context in which Hobbes wishes to be read by those most likely to be able to discern his intention. Those who have read Leo Strauss's Thoughts on Machiavelli, the essays on the Florentine by Harvey Mansfield and his commentary on the discourses on Livy, and other works by the students and the students of Leo Strauss, will not be surprised to learn that the same playfulness is evident in the 15th chapter of The Prince. The title of the chapter, with its reference to the qualities for which men are especially praised or blamed, echoes the language that Aristotle uses to introduce his famous discussion of the virtues and the vices in his Nicomachean Ethics, and similar language can be found in Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica. Students of classical Rome will recognize the advice that Machiavelli offers regarding the modes in government that a prince should adopt with regard to subjects and friends is precisely that which Marcus Tullius Cicero recommends for dealing with enemies. When Machiavelli speaks of those who've imagined republics and principalities, nearly everyone recognizes that he is alluding to Plato and Aristotle, and many recognize that he's referring also to the New Testament, to Augustine and to Aquinas, who speak of the kingdom of God. Some scholars have also noticed that Machiavelli's list of the qualities that bring either praise or blame is a parody of the list of virtues and vices found in the Nicomachean Ethics and in the Summa Theologica. That where Aristotle and Aquinas cataloged 11 virtues, each as a mean between two vicious extremes, Machiavelli not only lists 11 pairs of opposed qualities, such as cruelty and mercy, but also deliberately omits justice from consideration, and muddles the taxonomy, putting putative virtues first and vices second, then putting putative vices first and virtues second, and reversing himself in this regard again and again and again, all in preparation for his conclusion that honesty is not always the best policy, and his suggestion that what we call virtues and vices and what we call our postures that one needs to adopt according to one's convenience. One should not care about incurring the reputation of those vices without which it is difficult to save one's stato, he writes. For if one considers everything well, one will find that something appears to be virtue, which if pursued would be one's ruin, and that something else appears to be vice, which if pursued results in one's security and well-being. I belabor here what is well known for a reason. For what Machiavelli does to Plato, Aristotle, and their Christian successors in this chapter of The Prince, in turning their arguments inside out, Hobbes does to Machiavelli in the like-named chapter of his Leviathan. But before I turn from the 15th chapter of The Prince to the 15th chapter of Leviathan, let me say a few words about prior evidence for Hobbes' interest in Machiavelli. When Leo Strauss visited the seat of the Dukes of Devonshire at Chatsworth in the course of doing the research for the political philosophy of Hobbes, he turned up a manuscript of essays written in the manner of the essays published by Sir Francis Bacon in 1597, but penned in the handwriting of Thomas Hobbes. When Strauss proposed publishing these as an example of Hobbes' juvenilia, one reader for the press to which he submitted his proposal drew his attention and that of the press to the fact that these essays in revised form had been published already, anonymously, in 1620 in a little volume called Horae Subsequiae, Observation and Discourses, along with 2 additional essays and 3 discourses modeled on those found in Machiavelli's Discourses on Livy, with one of the latter already published in 1611 under the name of Sir William Cavendish, whom Hobbes had been hired to tutor 3 years before. Moreover, there was a note on the manuscript discovered by Strauss suggesting that although the 10 essays contained therein were in the hand of Hobbes, his student, Sir William Cavendish, was the author, and that they had been written to demonstrate the young man's accomplishments to his father. No one knows for sure who actually wrote the observations and the discourses. Word print analysis suggests that 2 different authors were involved and that Hobbes may have been the author of the 2 discourses first published in 1620. But none of this really matters, for one thing is clear. Each observation and each discourse was written in the Cavendish household by one or the other of the 2 young men, and Hobbes oversaw the project. This last fact is important because one of the items included within the Horae Subsequiae, thought by some to have been written by Hobbes, the piece entitled A Discourse Upon the Beginning of Tacitus, has as its focus the final destruction of the Roman Republic and the establishment of the Roman Principate under Augustus Caesar, whom Sir Francis Bacon had singled out as the supreme example of what he, consciously echoing Machiavelli's Prince, and the author of the Discourse on the Beginning of Tacitus spoke of as a new prince. Moreover, the account given of the new prince in this discourse by Hobbes or by his student echoes Machiavelli's discussion at every turn. So 31 years before the appearance of Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes and his student are playing around with the Prince and the Discourses on Livy. In short, it is perfectly clear that some 30 to 35 years before that, Hobbes and his people had given careful consideration to the centerpiece of Machiavelli's Prince, his discussion of the new prince. and that they had connected this discussion with what the Florentine had to say in Book 1, chapters 25 and 26 of his Discourses on Livy, concerning the manner in which a new prince, intent on introducing new modes and orders, would be well advised to proceed, which is precisely as Augustus did proceed. It is against this background, I believe, that one must understand what Hobbes does in the 15th chapter of Leviathan. Now, the author of a discourse upon the beginning of Tacitus was no friend to disorder. Civil war, he wrote, is the worst thing that can happen to a state. The author of the other discourse, attributed by some to Hobbes, a discourse of laws, is even more emphatic. In fact, he describes anarchy in terms foreshadowing the later description of the state of nature in Leviathan. If men were not limited within certain rules, such confusion would follow in government that the differences of right and wrong, just and unlawful, could never be distinguished. And that would cause such distraction in the people and give so great an overthrow to conversation and commerce amongst men that all right would be perverted by power and all honesty swayed by greatness, so that the equal administration of justice is the true knot that binds us to unity and peace among ourselves and disperses all such violent and unlawful courses as otherwise liberty would insinuate, preserving every man in his right and preventing others who, if they thought their actions might pass with impunity, would not measure their courses by the rule of aequum and justum, but by the square of their own benefit and affections, and so not being circumscribed within reasonable bounds, their reason becomes invisible. Whereas when they find that justice has a predominant power, they are deterred from proceeding in these acts that otherwise in their own wills and inclinations would give them leave to effect. It is, of course, this concern that drives Hobbes' treatment of the virtues and vices in Leviathan. The profound significance of the critique of morality initiated in the 15th chapter of the Prince, Hobbes readily, if tacitly, acknowledges. But he does so in a typically backhanded way. This he accomplishes in Leviathan by the simple expedient of devoting the like-numbered chapter of his book to moral virtues defense. He knew perfectly well why it was that in his own day, and now I'm quoting him, successful wickedness had obtained the name of virtue. Now, who says that successful wickedness is virtue? And so he singled out for attack an unidentified, but I think easily identified, fool who had said, not only in his heart, but with his tongue as well, that there is no such thing as justice. Well, who implied that there is no such thing as justice by leaving it off the list of possible virtues and vices? And Hobbes goes on to say about this fool that he contended that every man's conservation and contentment being committed to his own care, there could be no reason why every man might not do what he thought conduced thereunto. Precisely what Machiavelli says in chapter 15 of the Prince. And therefore also to make or not make, keep or not keep covenants was not against reason when it conduced to one's benefit, which Machiavelli says in the chapters immediately following the Prince. Careful readers at that time had little difficulty in figuring out just which fool had in mind. And if you go to James Harrington, he identifies the fool as Machiavelli. Of course, the Malmesbury philosopher was by no means alone in challenging Machiavelli's teaching concerning morality. In rejecting it, he had ample and highly respectable company. His peculiarity, that which made him the very model of a modern moralist, was that he grounded his critique of the Florentine's conclusions on the very arguments that the Florentine had himself advanced. If Hobbes came to be called the monster of Malmesbury, it was because he hewed to the effectual truth of the matter no less closely than the Florentine thought to have given the devil his moniker, Old Nick. Hobbes' argument takes the form of an exploration of the consequences inherent in accepting Machiavelli's famous assertion that a legislator must presuppose all men evil and presume that they will make use of the malignity hidden in their hearts at the first free opportunity. This premise Hobbes justifies by means of a phenomenology of mind foreshadowing that in Hegel, and it is no accident that Leo Strauss and Alexandra Kojève considered writing a book on the process of the development of political philosophy from Hobbes to Hegel. He begins with sensation, its unreliability, and the physiological grounds for doubting whether we can ever know with any precision what lies behind and occasions our perceptions. Then he turns to the natural play of the human imagination in order to bring home to his readers the dependence of all coherence of thought on desire, and to establish man's fundamental character as homo faber, as an inventor, a hunter of causes and effects, a fashioner of tools, driven by a lust of mind to investigate the consequences of particular actions. This claim has profound political implications, for the lust of mind which distinguishes Hobbesian man from the beast is not the idle curiosity of the contemplative. Like the longing for riches and honors, this lust may be reduced, he says, to a desire for power. And this leads on to man's understanding of himself in terms of power, and his attempt to assure forever the way of his future desires, which produces a perpetual and restless desire of power after power. The details of that discussion, I think, are probably familiar to you, so I will move past them to my conclusion. Hobbes is perfectly willing to concede that in man's natural condition, the notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice have no place. So he too drops justice out. As he puts it, force and fraud are in war the two cardinal virtues. So he agrees with Machiavelli. Moreover, he recognizes that Machiavelli's account nicely describes the situation of the sovereign, who remains within the state of nature. If he disagrees with the author of The Prince, it is only in his adoption of the perspective of ordinary men unlikely to become princes. It is insistent that in constructing a polity, a legislator must rely on the passions that incline men to peace, such as fear of death, desire of such things that are necessary to commodious living, and a hope by their industry to obtain them, and in his belief that the war of all against all need not persist. At this point, he restates the Epicurean count of the manner in which civil society emerged on the basis of the calculation of endangered men, recasting it in light of what he had gleaned from the speech of Thucydides' Mityleneans at Olympia, and from a passing observation by Thucydides' Athenians in the course of the Melian dialogue, as these remarks concerning the foundations for justice in international affairs could be reapplied to the manner in which equality can provide a foundation for justice between men who are in no way by nature friends. On the crucial question, Machiavelli argues that Hobbes argues that if Machiavelli was indeed right in asserting that security and well-being are the end of human life and the standard by which virtue and vice are to be defined, it is a dictate of reason that ordinary men trade submission for protection and not breach faith. For except in the case of those extraordinarily situated, the successful wickedness promoted by Machiavelli is an oxymoron. In elaborating the logical consequences of this argument, Hobbes establishes the principle of absolute sovereignty and restores the traditional virtues, justice, gratitude, modesty, equity, mercy, and the rest of the laws of nature to something like their traditional place. In the process, however, he acknowledges the Machiavellian foundations of this restored morality. These dictates of reason men used to call by name of laws, but improperly, for they are but conclusions or theorems concerning what conduceth to the conservation and defense of themselves. You will notice I have not mentioned once the executive power. In Professor Mansfield's book, he points to the fact that in Hobbes, the executive power absorbs the legislative and the judicial power. That in Hobbes, law makes its appearance solely as command. This is true because where there is no natural foundation for friendship and no natural foundation for justice, emergency is the normal condition. And emergencies always concentrate the legislative and the judicial power in the executive. Thank you.
Speakers did an excellent job staying within their allotted time, so now we have plenty of time for questions. I think Nancy has a mic, so when you do ask your question, please speak into the mic so that we can have it recorded.
Hi, this is for Professor Liebert. You raised the question of the end of the Roman Republic, was that the process, the result of a process of an inevitable cycle of regimes, or did I took you to be suggesting a non-inevitable empire destroy the Republic? Was I correct in taking your answer to be the latter, that the size of Rome is what destroyed the Republic? If so, what of the cycle of regimes? Was that still a factor? And wasn't Rome's great size inevitable? Isn't that the suggestion of, especially of Montesquieu's, on the greatness of the Romans and their decline, that a regime like the Roman one, with its emphasis on courage and military virtue, was going to either get destroyed or expand until it would collapse on itself?
Yeah, thanks. I didn't mean to stress, maybe as much as you took it, the inevitability or non-inevitability of expansion. I think it's possible for me to concede, as I'd probably want to, that it was more or less inevitable for the Roman regime to expand. I just wanted to highlight exactly what I thought the cause was of the decline that came from, that it was expansion and not these things related to the political regime. On the other hand, I don't think it's necessarily incompatible with the regime account to say that expansion had something to do with it. And so I was just trying to highlight, I guess, where the expansion played, what role that played in the decline.
This is for Karako. Thank you. Is the implication of your talk, or your implication of your interpretation of Harvey's book, that once you arrive at the point of Machiavelli, all of regime analysis, all of our political science is useless? That regimes were an element of classical political science only. This would be for Bob as well. And that once this doctrine of execution is introduced, regimes disappear completely. And therefore, all modern politics is a regime, aregimetic, in the absence of regimes. And there's some points in the book where maybe Harvey comes close to saying that, gee, in some ways, what we think of as different regimes, let's say U.S. and communism, in some ways both accept or have been influenced by this modern doctrine of the executive, which, if it's more important than the regime, means that the regime is subordinate to that. So the idea of the executive eliminates completely political science from political regimes from our analysis of politics. Is that what you were saying, Tom, and then ask Bob to comment?
I would say more or less that yes, in the first place, simply put it in terms of Aristotle's political science, the regime is not very present in an empire. It's too big to make present over such a wide swath. And so Machiavelli takes that and also Aristotle's comment that every regime, every actual regime, has injustice in it. Right, and so when you have the reality of empires, that exception, that quiet exception by Aristotle, becomes the rule, and you just accept that, and rather than try to deny it and re-rationalize it, just face up to facts. That these are what we have here are empires. They're mostly tyranny, but again, is there a political science that has something interesting and useful to say about empires? And so how can we make what on Aristotle's terms is a necessity of tyranny, how can we make that better? How can we moderate it and improve it? And so, yeah, the science of institutions is something different. And it has to be something different, I think, even on Aristotle's terms. And so why not face up to facts? We've got empires. It sure looks like tyranny, but let's see if we can't improve it a little bit.
Do you say you'd like Bob to comment as well?
Who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? What do I mean by that? We have rather oligarchic parties, the Republican that leans toward oligarchy with a popular consent, and we have rather Democratic Party, which is is moderated the other way. Similarly, in our politics, it makes a big difference whether a presidential candidate appears to be merely a kind of cunning, by the way, he shouldn't, on Machiavelli's grounds, he shouldn't appear to be cunning, but nevertheless, if he has a kind of reputation for being a cunning trimmer, he's suspect. It seems to me that an accurate political science that just looks at things is going to have a variety of things to learn, of course, from the Aristotelian analysis. Also, the truculence of people when they think they're being imposed upon as opposed to having a voice is also very, very visible. So it seems to be whatever our institutional political science, it isn't adequate to describe the facts on the whole. But there is an enormous qualification of the old ways by the new ways. I don't deny that at all. So that would be very important to take into account in describing this country. Just our use of the term constitution in a certain way takes us some way. But it seems to me the phenomena of politics and of morals are not adequately described by an institutional political science, which has to be corrected just so to speak phenomenologically. I'm not sure that's what you're getting at, Jim.
Paul, you tantalized us right at the end of your remarks, with some very cryptic and elliptical links between Hobbes' account or non-account of executive power on the one hand and the idea of political emergency on the other. And because this is not a small matter, I'd like to invite you to expand on that so we can see what you actually think about the connection.
Hobbes' discussion of the state of nature involves the notion that war is the normal condition between human beings. And his phenomenological account in the early chapters of Leviathan describes a human being who understands himself only in terms of his power, and therefore understands others only in terms of their being an obstacle. In that situation, emergency is the norm, and that individual in the state of nature possesses what John Locke will later call the executive power of the state of nature. The state of nature is brought to an end by a calculation and a covenant in which obedience is exchanged for protection. But the civility that is created by that, and therefore the possibility of practicing all of the traditional moral virtues, if only out of calculation, because to get along, you've got to go along, is from Hobbes' perspective extremely fragile. And part of the fragility, I think, is brought out very well in Professor Mansfield's chapter, because the sovereign, on the one hand, has authority, but how effective he is in keeping the peace depends upon his practice of what Hobbes sometimes calls the art of government and on other occasions calls prudence. So in a way, the problem of wisdom doesn't go away. And that means the emergency doesn't go away. If the sovereign slips, if he stirs up a rebellion by being imprudent, you're back in the soup. And so Hobbes is never willing to move away from the notion that you must obey. And in that sense, all of the power remains, which he abstracts. And he has to abstract it in order to bring together all of the powers in the hands of the sovereign, who is executive, he's the legislator, and he judges.
Terry, can I just say something here? What you said is surely correct as far as it goes, but isn't there this very problematic element in the Leviathan itself, where Hobbes seems to speak of the possibilities that a new education will bring about, and he even somewhat dreamily, maybe not very precisely, talks of the possibility, perhaps, of peace coming on the world in a way that's never been foreseen before. And this is after he talks about the need to change what's in the universities and change things. In other words, I'm just wondering, agreeing with the direction of your remark, I wanted to qualify it by wondering whether the notion of the malleability of all higher things in us opens the way for a kind of understanding of a change in human beings in a pacific way. Do you see that in the Leviathan?
Where it would come in is the contribution of Hobbes himself. That is to say, if the Leviathan were taught in the universities in place of Aristotle, and if the Leviathan were preached by those who study in the universities and go on to join the clergy, Hobbes at one point suggests that you could actually have something like the philosophical kingship of Plato's Republic. This comes right in the middle of the book. And the project, in some sense, requires that wisdom to be completed. And it is a wisdom that the sovereign must possess by way of studying Hobbes, so that he understands what his duty is, what his role is. But most important of all, it's something that ordinary people must possess, because they have a tendency in conditions of civility to forget the fragility of civility. And Hobbes' entire project, I think, is to bring home to people the fragility of civility, especially in face of the myths propagated by clergymen, lawyers, and academics in conditions of civility that lead to quarreling.
Paul, I wanted to ask you if your argument that Hobbes' remarks about keeping covenants can be read as a response to Machiavelli's claims about princes keeping the faith assumes that sovereigns, or the sovereign, is subject to a contract or subject to a covenant.
No, the sovereign is not.
Oh, is that not? And so I'm asking,
he's
does
in
the
the
argument...
position of the prince. So the prince, in some sense, as advice to sovereigns, remains intact in the face of Hobbes' criticism. But if you remember in chapter 15, the advice that Hobbes gives, if you take the title seriously, is not only given to princes, but to men generally. Now, of course, Machiavelli gives. Machiavelli is very interested in new princes, and new princes begin as non-princes. And Hobbes is not willing to give such advice to non-princes.
It's only fitting that we give Professor Mansfield a chance to ask a question or make a comment or a response, if you would like.
Later on.
Okay, so you don't. Okay. Anyone else? Okay, I think we can move down the hall for a break, and we'll begin again at 11 o'clock for the second panel.
By the way, responsible. That was very, very nicely laid out. The whole visibility and invisibility business, and the manner in which